My movement caused him to recoil. It wasn't the startled jump of a frightened puppy, but the stealing of a soldier anticipating a blow. The shelter in Colorado Springs was a cacophony of barks and the sound of tails thwacking against chain-link fences. Sunlight streamed in through the skylights. Volunteers offered smiles. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of disinfectant and palpable fear. And there, amidst it all, a German shepherd puppy of 6 months named Monty was huddled in the deepest corner of his kennel, trembling so violently that his water bowl vibrated. I halted. He made no sound. No barking, no whining. He was simply paralyzed. He had one front paw drawn in beneath him, as if to protect an old injury. The black and tan fur on his torso was clumped and matted. His eyes, dark and liquid, held a human-like depth that made my own chest constrict as they fixed upon me. He did not blink. "Easy, buddy," I murmured, instinctively relaxing my posture. I kept my hands low and my shoulders down, the same non-threatening stance I'd taken when approaching children after an IED detonation. Don't startle them. Move slowly. Let them approach you. But Monty remained motionless. He only stared. Then he recoiled once more, as though my quiet words alone had caused him pain. A young woman on staff, whose name was Crystal, came up behind me. "That's Monty. He was abandoned behind a boarded-up gas station last month. It took us hours to get him. He just kept trying to hide under heaps of trash. He's different. Has anyone shown interest in him?" I asked, though I was already certain of the answer. "No, he won't let anyone get close except for the night cleaner. And she has to be singing for him to tolerate it." I glanced back at the puppy, a 6-month-old German shepherd, already behaving as if the world had forsaken him and he had decided to do the same in return. My visit was not for adoption. I was only there to gather blankets for a supply drive for veterans. But I heard the question leave my lips before I could think to stop it. What would be involved in getting him out of this place, just for the weekend? She blinked in surprise. "You have fostering approval." I did not. And yet, a mere 20 minutes later, I found myself holding a leash in one hand, a silent, trembling Monty walking beside me. There was no crate, no wag of a tail, only quiet, measured steps and a pair of eyes that never stopped watching my every move. Inside the car, he paid no attention to the world outside the window, nor did he sniff the new environment. He just coiled into a tight ball on the floor, seemingly trying to make himself disappear. "You're safe now," I told him. "No one will harm you here." He showed no reaction. When we arrived home, he became immobile at the front door, refusing to step over the threshold. I gave him slack on the leash and backed away. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes before he finally put one paw inside, and then the other. He made his way directly under the kitchen table and stayed there. I took a seat on the floor, resting my back against the cabinet, and simply waited. I'm not sure how long we sat like that, the two of us silent, both uncertain of what was to come. A 6-month-old German shepherd puppy, terrified of doorways and food bowls, was now asleep at my feet, as though the very floor might give way beneath him. It had been 10 months since I'd left the army. I had thought I'd witnessed the full spectrum of damage life could inflict. But Monty was on another level entirely. I didn't get much sleep that night, not because Monty was noisy. He was perfectly still. I found myself listening for him constantly. Every creak of the house, every slight change in the air, caused me to turn my head, half expecting to hear him cry out or try to flee. He remained under the table, silent and out of sight. At 2:17 a.m., I heard a single whimper. It was a brief, fractured sound, like something escaping through a tiny crack. I didn't rise. I didn't speak. I just whispered, "Me, too," and waited for the quiet to resume. By the next morning, his food was untouched. The bowl remained full next to a water dish that was also undisturbed. As I entered the kitchen, he retreated even further into the corner, pressing himself against the wall as if it might absorb him. I knelt down, making sure not to meet his gaze directly, and nudged the bowl an inch in his direction. "It's all right," I murmured. "You don't need to trust me. Just don't quit." There was no response. I poured a cup of black coffee, sat at the table right over him, and opened a book I had no intention of reading, just to give him space. 30 minutes went by, then an hour. I stayed put until I heard a noise, a lap, just once, and then again. I didn't look down. When my coffee was gone, the bowl was half eaten. As I got up, Monty flinched, but it was slower this time, less of a reflex and more like a deeply ingrained memory. I said nothing and just let him be. That afternoon, I set the back door to the yard ajar and walked away from it. I didn't call to him. I just provided a clear path. A few minutes later, I heard hesitant steps on the tile, followed by the faint creak of the screen door being pushed open. He stood in the doorway, as if uncertain that the world outside was real. I sat on the porch steps with my back to him, watching the pine trees sway. "Come on, Monty," I said gently. "It's only the wind, no sound to it." Then, a paw made contact with the wooden deck. I didn't turn, but I smiled. The sunlight touched his coat for the first time since he'd come home, making the black and tan fur shine with a brilliance he seemed unaware he possessed. He sniffed at the grass, took a step, and then froze at the sound of a neighbor's dog. He immediately retreated back inside to his spot under the table. Just like that. I let him go. I didn't pressure him. I understood what it felt like for the world to frighten you into hiding. That evening, I set his food bowl nearer to the living room, away from the table. It was a small test. I remained on the sofa, feigning interest in a book. He held out until I switched off the lamp. Then I heard it. The soft patting of paws on the floor, followed by the gentle sound of kibble in a metal dish. A 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy taking one small step beyond where he had been the day before. It might not have seemed like much, but to me, it was monumental. I didn't know he was observing me until I dropped a spoon. It hit the hardwood with a clatter, and I flinched, a habit of years that was hard to shake. But when I looked up, Monty was peering out from behind the table leg. His ears were slightly raised. His body didn't retreat. "Hey," I said softly, bending to retrieve the spoon. "I guess we're both a little jumpy." He didn't move, but he also didn't hide. That alone felt like a victory. After that, I began talking to him more. Not giving commands, just sharing thoughts, memories, things I hadn't voiced in years. I told him about being caught in a monsoon in Kandahar, and how my boots had squished for 3 straight days. I told him about the friend I lost a week before the end of my final deployment. I talked about my mother's pot roast and my inability to cook rice without burning it. He offered no judgment, just listened from the shadows. It was on the 4th day that he emerged into the open while I was cooking eggs. There was no sound, no warning. I felt a brush against the back of my leg and nearly dropped the skillet. Monty was standing right there, his tail low but not tucked, his head lowered but his eyes looking up at me. I held perfectly still. We stood in that silence for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 10 seconds. I slowly knelt to one knee and held my hand out, hovering. Not reaching, not demanding, just offering. He sniffed it once, then sat. Not next to me, not touching me, just nearby, as if to test the concept of being seen and remaining safe. I whispered, "There you are." He blinked. Later that afternoon, I took out his leash and simply placed it on the floor. He stared at it as if it might attack him. I didn't insist. I just left it in the middle of the room, letting it become part of the furniture. The next morning, he gave it a sniff. By the 3rd day, he batted it once with his paw and then looked at me. That was all the encouragement I required. We walked down the driveway together. There was no pulling, no fighting the leash, just quiet footsteps and frequent, shifting glances. A neighbor passed and waved. "New dog," he called out. I nodded. "Just fostering. His name's Monty." The man smiled. "Handsome guy, that German Shepherd." I nodded again. "Yeah, it just needs time." Monty pressed himself closer to my leg as a car drove by. I could feel the tremor in his body, so subtle I might have missed it if I wasn't attuned to it. But he didn't run. He didn't bolt. He stayed. That night, he trailed me down the hallway and settled outside my bedroom door. He didn't attempt to enter. He just lay there, on guard, his breathing slow and even, as if he were anchoring both of us to the ground. I didn't sleep well, but for the first time in months, it wasn't because I felt alone. The sound of his breathing became a familiar, soft, steady presence just beyond my door. Every night for a week, Monty assumed the same position in the hallway, curled up tightly, as though still trying to make himself small enough to vanish. But he didn't vanish. He stayed. One morning, I opened my bedroom door to find him sitting up, watching it as if he had been waiting for hours. His ears were alert, his eyes brighter. Not a full spark, not yet, but the pilot light was on. "Morning," I said, and he tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decipher the word's meaning. I began leaving the door ajar at night. He never entered, but I saw his shadow fall across the threshold more than once as he tested the boundary. When I prepared breakfast, he would sit near the kitchen entrance, no longer under the table, no longer hiding, just near, observing, learning me. And I was learning him. He disliked a loud television, was suspicious of the dishwasher, and flinched at the blender's buzz. Yet, he ignored thunder and slept through fireworks, while the rustle of a plastic bag sent him scrambling with his tail between his legs. I didn't ask why. I just took note. On day 11, I received a call from the shelter. They were inquiring if I intended to bring him back or if I would continue fostering. I looked down at Monty, who was asleep with his head on my boot, and said, "He's not going back." They laughed and said they had suspected as much. "He chose you," Crystal said. I wanted to think that was true, but it felt more like we had both chosen silence. We had both just stopped running. That afternoon, I tried to get him into the truck, the same one we'd driven home in. He froze at the open door, planting all four paws as if they were bolted to the concrete, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow. "No pressure," I told him. "Just a ride." I got in and waited. He didn't budge. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Suddenly, without warning, he leaped in with a single, fluid motion. No hesitation. But when I glanced over, he was trembling again. I started the engine. He didn't whimper or bark. He just curled into a tight ball on the passenger seat, pressing himself against the door. I drove slowly, nowhere in particular, just a loop around the neighborhood. He never once lifted his head, but he stayed. When we returned home, I opened his door. He didn't jump out immediately. He waited for me to get out first. I stood beside the truck and whispered, "Come on, Monty." He hesitated, then hopped down. We walked inside together, without a leash, without a word. That night, I discovered him curled up at the foot of my bed. He looked up at me once, then rested his head with a soft sigh, as if he finally believed we were going to stay. It happened around 3 a.m. I woke up gasping, soaked in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to break free. The room was dark, but I knew my location. I just felt completely disconnected from it. Panic coiled around my chest, squeezing until the air felt dense and useless. Then I felt it. A warmth that wasn't panic, that wasn't a nightmare. It was Monty. He was standing by the bed, his head tilted, one paw resting lightly on my arm. He made no sound. He didn't jump, nudge, or lick. He just placed his paw there, as if to ground me. I don't know how long we remained like that. A minute, maybe 10. My breathing gradually slowed, my fists unclenched. When I could finally speak, it was barely a whisper. "Thank you." Monty lowered his paw, turned in a circle once, and laid down beside the bed, not as a guard, just as a presence. I stared at the ceiling, fully awake, but no longer afraid. The next morning, he didn't run when the coffee grinder started. He didn't flinch when I dropped the cereal box. He followed me to the garage without hesitation, sat patiently while I loaded tools, and even sniffed at the rake as if it were nothing. We drove to a quiet canyon trail I used to hike before things got difficult. I didn't attach the leash immediately, just opened the door and waited. Monty looked around, his ears twitching. The wind blew pine needles across the dirt path. A distant crow called out. Then, slowly, he jumped down and stood beside me. We walked the first half-mile in silence. He stayed near, always on my left side, his head low but his senses sharp. Every so often, he would glance up at me, as if checking to see if I still belonged here. I didn't feel like I did. Not yet. But he did. We came to a clearing where the trail opened up. I sat on a fallen log, and Monty lay in the grass next to me. He watched the trees and listened to the wind, and for a moment, he looked like any other dog, young, free, and whole. I reached down and touched his back. He didn't flinch. When I scratched behind his ears, he leaned into my hand. That was the first time I saw him close his eyes in peace. Later that day, I brought him to the local vet clinic for a checkup and to update his shots. I warned them that he could be skittish and didn't handle strangers well. But Monty surprised me. He didn't panic. He sat by my side in the waiting room, watching the door. When our name was called, he matched my pace. When the vet knelt to greet him, Monty sniffed her hand and then looked back at me. He was asking, "Is this safe?" And without a word, I let him know that it was. Back at home, he ate his dinner next to my chair, not under the table. I watched him fall asleep with his chin on the rug, his ears twitching as he dreamed. 6 months old, just a puppy, yet somehow already braver than I was. A week later, I clipped the leash on him, and he didn't recoil. It was early morning, the sun casting a golden light over Colorado Springs, and Monty stood by the front door as if he were ready. Not eager or excited, but willing. That was enough. We began walking a loop around the neighborhood. Initially, he stayed glued to my side, each step careful and cautious. Every passing car made his ears go flat. A dropped trash can lid 2 houses away send a tremor through his body, but he didn't bolt. He looked up at me, and I offered him what I could, a calm, quiet presence. The same thing he had given me that night. I couldn't breathe. We passed a woman jogging with her golden retriever. Her dog was wagging its tail and pulled toward Monty. Monty froze, his tail low, his muscles tense. I remained silent. The woman smiled. Just nervous. He's learning, I said. She nodded. Aren't we all? After that walk, something changed. Monty began to follow me from room to room. It wasn't out of anxiety, but curiosity. If I went to the shed, he would wait in the doorway, his head tilted. If I did laundry, he would sit by the basket. If I sat on the porch with my coffee, he would lie beside my chair, his eyes scanning the yard like a sentry. He didn't bark or whine, but he was simply there. That kind of quiet loyalty was something I hadn't felt in a long time. I enrolled him in a basic training class the next weekend, mostly for socialization in a controlled environment with safe introductions. The trainer, a man named Darren, took one look at Monty and said, "This one's seen things." I didn't argue. Monty stayed close during the class. We worked on simple commands: sit, stay, leave it. He was hesitant and slow to react. But when he did it right, and I said, "Good boy," something behind his eyes lit up. Just a flicker, as if he were remembering the dog he could be. But it wasn't simple. The room was a swirl of activity. Other dogs barked, treats were dropped. People clapped. Monty's eyes darted around constantly, as if mapping out all the exits. At one point, a Labrador barked suddenly behind him, and Monty dropped to the floor. It wasn't playful, it was pure fear. I knelt beside him, my hand hovering near his neck. "You're okay," I said. "You're not there. You're here." And for the first time, he leaned into my touch. Back home, we sat in the backyard under a sky filled with orange clouds. I threw a ball, not really expecting a reaction. Monty just watched it bounce and then looked back at me. I laughed. Fair enough. One miracle at a time. I didn't need him to play fetch. I needed him to stay beside me, his head resting on my shoe as if it were the safest spot on earth. He wasn't chasing balls, but he was chasing something far more important. He was chasing trust. And somehow, so was I. Monty started waiting by the door before I even reached for the leash. Every morning now, he would sit there, head held high, ears alert, not wagging, just watching. It wasn't excitement. It was something calmer, like a sense of purpose. We walked the same trail each day, the same quiet loop of pine trees and crunching gravel. He still got startled sometimes by loud tires or falling branches, but he no longer retreated. He would glance at me, check in, and then continue on, side by side. That day, we passed a father and his son walking a golden retriever. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 5, pointed at Monty and shouted, "Army dog." Monty froze. The words seemed to strike something deep within him. The boy laughed and clapped, oblivious. His father gave a polite nod and continued on. But Monty remained still, his ears low, his body rigid. I knelt beside him and whispered, "You're okay, bud. You're not what they called you. You're just Monty now." He looked at me, then down at my hand, and slowly pressed his head into my palm. We sat on a bench after that, just watching the wind rustle the trees. His breathing evened out. The ache in my chest subsided. I realized I hadn't had a panic-induced flashback in a few days, and I wondered if it was because of him or just a coincidence. I didn't care which. When we got home, he did something new. As I unclipped his leash, Monty walked into the living room, jumped onto the couch without a second thought, and curled up right on the center cushion. I stood there amazed. "Are you serious?" I asked. He gave me a slow blink, then tucked his nose under his paw. I laughed for the first time in weeks. Not a forced laugh, but a real one, from deep in my gut. "You win." That night, I sat next to him. We watched an old movie that I wasn't really paying attention to. His breathing fell into sync with mine. At one point, I shifted, and his paw came to rest on my leg. He didn't pull it back. He just left it there, as if to say, This is my place, and I'm not leaving. The following day, I took him back to the training center. This time, he entered with more self-assurance, still cautious, but with a clear sense of purpose. The trainer, Darren, let out a low whistle. Damn, he looks like a different dog. He's not, I said. He's just finally letting us see who he is. We worked on more advanced commands, longer stays, healing, and even some basic obstacle courses. Monty was focused, observant. His gaze rarely left me. During a group activity, a young woman lost her grip on her shepherd mix, and the dog lunged in our direction. In that split second, I saw Monty's old fear flash in his eyes, stiff shoulders, rapid breathing. But then he stepped in front of me, just one paw forward, protective and alert. The trainer intervened, separating the dogs. There was no contact, no harm done. But Monty hadn't run. He had held his ground. You're something else, I whispered, kneeling beside him. You don't even realize it, do you? He blinked once, then leaned against me. And for the first time, I didn't wonder if he could be a service dog. I wondered if he already was. I sat with the application form in my hands for over an hour before I wrote a single word. It was for a specialized training program for service animals, specifically for veterans managing PTSD. One intake question struck me hard. Has your dog demonstrated natural protective or grounding behavior during episodes of emotional distress? I looked across the room at Monty, curled up by the window, observing the world with those quiet, knowing eyes. Yeah, I whispered. He has. I wasn't sure if a 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy could officially be classified as a working dog yet, but Monty was no longer just a puppy. He was something more stable, more serene, still scared at times, still quiet, but always watchful, always present, as if he could sense the storm before I even knew it was gathering. That night, I had a flashback. It came without warning, the kind that throws you right back into the heat, the dust, the screaming radios. I was in the garage, looking for an old box of winter clothes, when the smell of motor oil and metal hit me like a physical blow. I froze, my hands braced on a shelf, my eyes wide, my breathing ragged. And then Monty was there, before I even realized I needed him. No barking, no panic, just the firm, warm pressure of his body against my leg. I sank to my knees, and he stayed with me, solid and unmoving, until my breathing calmed and my hands stopped shaking. He didn't fix me, he anchored me. Afterward, I just sat on the garage floor with him for a long time, his head in my lap, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. I ran my hand over his back, feeling the solid muscle, the steadiness. I whispered, "You saved me again, didn't you?" He lifted his head just enough to nudge my chin. The next day, I sent in the application. The waiting list was extensive, but the program coordinator called after she read my statement. "Your German Shepherd puppy sounds extraordinary," she said. "Would you be willing to bring him in for an evaluation?" "Absolutely," I replied. "He's ready." But honestly, I wasn't sure if I was. Monty didn't care about labels or credentials. He didn't need a vest or a title to do what he did. He just needed to be close. That was his purpose. That was his gift. We drove to the evaluation center early that Saturday. He sat alert in the passenger seat the entire way, ears up, eyes steady. When we arrived, he looked at me before I even opened the door, as if he understood the importance of the moment. Inside, they asked me to detail his triggers, his conduct in crowds, and his response to distress. I told them the truth. He dislikes sudden hand movements. He flinches at a raised voice, but he never leaves my side. Not ever. They evaluated his responsiveness, his patience, and his capacity to follow commands under pressure. He passed every test. But the moment that gave them pause, the one that made an evaluator lean back and blink twice, was when they simulated a panic episode. I sat in a chair, closed my eyes, focused on my own heartbeat, and let the anxiety rise just enough to feel authentic. And Monty? He pressed his body against mine, laid his head on my lap, and remained completely still. When it was over, the room was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then someone whispered, "That's not training. That's instinct." And in that moment, I knew Monty wasn't just a good dog. He was made for this. It began like any other night. Monty was curled on the rug by my bed, his back to the wall as usual. I brushed my teeth, switched off the light, and let the quiet settle. For a time, all was still. But around 3:40 a.m., the darkness shifted. My body went rigid before I understood why. A cold, heavy, ancient feeling washed over me. My breath caught, then stopped. It was the kind of panic that doesn't make an entrance. It simply arrives and consumes everything. I couldn't breathe. I sat bolt upright, but the sensation was like drowning. The walls began to blur. My chest burned for air, but my lungs wouldn't work. My hands were shaking violently, and I had no sense of where I was. Bedroom, bunker, street, it was all the same. Then I felt him. Monty was moving, not with panic, but with quick, certain purpose. He leaped onto the bed, not in a frenzy, but with precision. He pressed one paw on my shoulder, then the other. His body was heavy, grounding, his chest against mine, heartbeat to heartbeat. He wasn't licking my face or whining. He was holding me down, keeping me here. His weight, his warmth, his slow, steady, real breath began to pull me from the spiral. I reached up blindly, my hand grabbing a fistful of his fur like a lifeline in the darkness. And he held still. He stayed. I don't know if we were like that for minutes or much longer. But eventually, the vice on my lungs loosened, and air returned, ragged, shaky, but it came. When I opened my eyes, his face was just inches from mine. His ears were low, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with intense focus. "You brought me back," I whispered, my voice a thread. He blinked once, shifted his weight, and rested his head on my chest. That was the first time I cried in front of him, not from fear or loss, but from relief. This 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy had accomplished what therapy, medication, and silence could not. He had reached me. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring into my coffee as if it held all the answers. Monty was lying under the table again, not from fear this time, but from habit, from comfort. I reached down, stroking his head, and said the words out loud for the first time. "You're not just my dog." He looked up, his ears twitching. "You're my lifeline." Later that week, a call came from the program coordinator. "Monty's been approved for full PTSD service certification. He'll need one more supervised session, but his behavior under distress is remarkable." I was speechless, not because I was surprised, but because deep down, I had known all along. He hadn't become a service dog that night. He already was one. He had just proven it in the dark, when no one was watching and I needed him most. The vest came in a plain brown box, without ceremony. It sat on the kitchen counter for hours as I just stared at it. Monty circled the table a few times, sniffed it once, and then looked at me with that calm, indecipherable gaze of his. The patch stitched on the side read, "PTSD Service Dog. Do not distract." I held it, feeling its weight, not just the nylon and thread, but the significance it held for both of us. When I finally fastened the straps around his chest, Monty stood perfectly still. He didn't flinch or shift. He just accepted it, as if he were stepping into a role that had always been destined for him. "You earned this," I whispered, adjusting the last strap. "You earned every single inch of it." We took our first trip in public that afternoon, to a hardware store. It was loud, crowded, and filled with fluorescent lights, rattling carts, and echoing voices. Monty walked beside me, poised and calm. People stared, some smiled. A few pointed. A little girl asked her mother what kind of dog he was. The mother answered softly, "He's a German Shepherd puppy, sweetie. But he's working, so we don't pet." Monty paid them no mind. He stayed focused on me. Every step, every turn, he was present. I hadn't realized how much tension I carried in public places until that walk. But Monty seemed to know. Every time I tensed up, he would move closer. If I paused in an aisle, he would lean slightly against my leg. No sound, no drama, just there. At the checkout, the cashier leaned over and said, "He's a beautiful dog. You must have spent years training him." I smiled. He trained me. Outside, as I opened the passenger door, Monty waited for the signal. I tapped the seat, and he leaped in gracefully, settled in his spot, and stared out the windshield as if scouting the road ahead. We drove home without speaking, but the silence felt full and safe. That night, I opened an email I hadn't had the courage to touch for months. It was an invitation from a local veterans outreach center. They were starting a new peer mentorship program, connecting former service members with support animals. They were looking for volunteers. I stared at the screen, hesitant. The thought of walking into a room of strangers, even other vets, still made my chest tighten. Monty was at my feet, head on his paws, watching me from under the table. You think we could help someone else? I asked out loud. He didn't have to move. The next morning, we walked through the doors of the center together. Me in jeans and an old hoodie. Monty in his vest. Heads turned. Someone remarked, "That's the dog from the evaluations." A man in the corner, maybe in his late 30s, with tattoos on both arms and eyes hollowed by too many sleepless nights, locked his gaze on Monty. Monty looked back, then slowly walked over to him. He sat down, calm and watchful. The man stared for a long moment, then whispered something I couldn't make out. Monty held his gaze. Later, the man approached me and asked, "What's his name?" "Monty." He nodded. "I haven't touched a dog in 7 years." I shook his hand. That's when I understood this was no longer just about me. Monty wasn't only my lifeline. He was becoming something much bigger. We kept going back. Every Thursday afternoon, Monty and I walked through the doors of the Veterans Center. No fanfare, no announcements, just quiet steps and a gaze that communicated more than words ever could. Some of the guys were quiet, others couldn't stop talking. Some laughed too loudly, some not at all. But every single one of them watched Monty. At first, it was from a distance, then from across the room. Slowly, one by one, they began to reach out. A hand on his back, a scratch behind the ear, a whispered, "Good boy," as if they were unsure they had the right to say it. Monty accepted it all with the same tranquility he offered me, never seeking attention, just providing a presence. Somehow that was enough. One man, Ben, sat in the corner for 3 weeks without saying a word to me. On the 4th week, he asked if he could walk Monty to the courtyard. I agreed. They were gone for 15 minutes. When they came back, Ben's eyes were red. He offered no explanation. None was needed. Later, I saw him standing next to Monty, one hand resting on the vest, the other holding a cigarette that had burned down to the filter without him taking a single drag. "He's more than a dog," Ben said. I nodded. "He's a soldier just like us." That weekend, I built a raised bed for Monty next to mine. Not because he required it, but because I wanted him closer. That night, he climbed onto it without hesitation, curled into a posture of trust, pressed his back against my leg, and let out a sigh as if he finally knew he was home. I slept for 8 consecutive hours for the first time in 2 years. The next morning, I received a call from a local news station. Someone at the center had shared our story. They wanted to feature Monty in a segment on service animals and recovery. My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want the spotlight. I didn't want to have to explain. But then I looked at Monty, his head on his paws, ears twitching at the sound of birds outside. I thought of all the other men and women still waking up alone in the dark. "Yeah," I said. "We'll do it." The interview was straightforward. I spoke about the early days, the flinching, the silence, the first night he rescued me. The reporter asked, "When did you know he was different?" I answered without having to think. "The night I couldn't breathe, and he made me stay." Monty sat beside me the whole time, composed and serene, wearing his vest with that quiet, steady gaze. After the piece aired, emails began to pour in from other vets, from families, from shelters. People wrote that they had lost hope, that they didn't think dogs like Monty existed, that maybe they would visit a rescue that weekend. I read every message, some aloud, some more than once. Monty never reacted to the attention or the praise. But one night, as I sat by the fire pit in the yard, watching embers float up toward the stars, he walked over and gently placed his paw on my knee. There was no sound, just that same simple message he had always given me. "I'm here. We're okay." And for the first time, I truly believed him. Monty's journey from abandoned to healer is a profound one. I used to believe that rescue was a one-way transaction. You save a dog, you give it a second chance. The reality, I've learned, is that sometimes they are the ones who pull you from the wreckage. Monty was found behind a gas station, trembling, silent, and forgotten. Now, he enters rooms filled with combat veterans and offers them a sense of peace. He grounds me when the nightmares strike. He leans into the brokenness of others without hesitation. He is more than just a German Shepherd puppy with a vest. He is a healer, a soldier in his own right. Every time I see him rest his head in the lap of someone who believed they would never feel safe again, I am reminded of that night in my bedroom. The panic, the weight, the paw on my chest. He didn't ask for my trust. He showed me how to find it.